I often hear from non-religious people that they will never read the Bible because there's no point to it. Because they are not religious or practicing Christians or something, reading the Bible has absolutely no value to them. And I think that those people are really shortchanging themselves. I really think they're depriving themselves of one of the great literary experiences in the world. I think in addition to being probably the most influential book ever written, the Bible is one of the best books ever written. There are parts of it that are incredibly tedious, but there are just brilliant stories in it. And so I want to talk about that and why non-religious people don't read the Bible and why I think that they should. So I think that people who swear off reading the Bible tend to come from one of two backgrounds. Either they are formerly religious, they were raised in a religious household and force-fed religion as a kid, and then lost their faith as adults and just swore off the whole thing and want nothing to do with religion. The second group of people, I think, are the people who were raised in non-religious households and therefore think they are on a sort of higher plane of existence for that reason. That they are on this balcony looking down at all these ignorant masses who think that this book that is so full of crazy stuff happening and contradictions and that is very obviously a product of its time and place, they think that they're on some balcony looking down on all these ignorant masses who are duped by this fraud, and so they kind of feel like they've moved past the Bible, like they don't need it, like there's no point in that sense. And I have far more sympathy with that first group of people because, I get it. I get why someone would just want to not have anything to do with religion anymore after a bad childhood in a religious household. In a strictly religious household. But I, personally, am actually much closer to being of that second demographic. So I've never talked explicitly about my own background with religion on my channel. I think I've alluded to it a couple of times, but I know I've never sort of explicitly come out and explained myself. Not that you need to explain yourself with regards to religion on BookTube, but I've never done it. And, it feels weird, it feels odd that I talk about religion so much on my channel without ever having actually talked about my own life in religion. So in terms of my own relationship with religion, there hasn't been much of one. I like to say I was raised in a nest of heathens. Both of my parents are atheists. My brother is an atheist. Most of my extended family are non-religious. I don't know if they're all atheists, but certainly they're non-religious, except for one branch of my family who are Jehovah's Witnesses, which is kind of a weird anecdote on its own. But I was raised in a non-religious household. I could count on one hand the number of times I've been to church, and one of those times was when I was baptized as a baby, and I was baptized primarily to make my mom's grandmother happy, not really because my parents had any interest in my brother and myself being Christians. So I am much closer to being from that second demographic of people who think that they are somehow superior, and think they're so clever for knowing that the Bible is not, in fact, a literal testament to the Word of God. And yet, I have had a very intimate, deep relationship with the Bible since I was a kid. I asked my parents to get me an illustrated children's Bible when I was very, very young. And when I got older, I started to read the actual Bible, and eventually I managed to make my way through the entire thing after several false starts. And I just remember being swept up by the stories. I love the story of Samson and Delilah. I think that the story of David in the 2 books of Samuel, I think, is one of the just greatest character studies ever. The story of the Gospels, it took me a while to get on board with the story of Jesus. I didn't quite see what all the fuss was about with the Gospels for a while, but now I see Jesus as an incredibly fascinating, compelling character who I have a very complicated view of, but who I am very interested in. And the stories in the book of Genesis are just endlessly weird and fascinating. I love them. So I was just swept up by the Bible as a collection of stories, and I don't know quite what it was about me that allowed me to view it in that way, without caring about the fact that it's a religious text and the fact that so many people in the world view it as, the literal inspired word of God. Maybe it's because I had such a vivid imagination as a kid, and I sort of imagined all these really weird things happening just sort of in my head anyway, and I really liked fantasy and all this stuff. So it was, when I learned about Noah's flood, it was like, well, okay, that's cool. It was just, they were cool stories. And I think the crux of the problem with people who are non-religious who don't want to read the Bible is that they're so hung up on the fact that the Bible is viewed as the literal inspired word of God by such a significant proportion of the human population, and they can't get past that. And I think that they just need to accept that there are going to be people who believe that and just look at it as a work of literature anyway. I view the Bible much more in the way that I view the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, or the Mahabharata, the ancient Indian epic, or the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, or the Kalevala, the Finnish epic. I view it much more like one of those foundational cultural epics than I do as a religious text. And when you think about it, it does have a lot of similarities to a lot of these epic poems. For example, in the Iliad, there's that second book where Homer stops the action and lists all of these different nations who have come to the Trojan War, and all the heroes who are leading those nations. And in the Bible, you have many, 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 many lists of people and genealogies and lists of warriors. There's this whole section of one of the books of Samuel that's just a list of the heroes in King David's army. You look at the Kalevala, and it has a creation story, and it has the origin story for all sorts of things, and why things are the way they are right now. And the Bible does too. And the Bible obviously also is a sort of semi-historical account of the kings of Judah and Israel, and just the Israelites in general, and their coming out of Egypt and such, as something like the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi is. And the Bible also has long extended philosophical digressions, like the Mahabharata. Famously the Mahabharata has that small section called the Bhagavad Gita, and the Bible has something like that too. It's called the Book of Job, and in something like the Book of Job, these timeless philosophical questions are raised, and you might look at a book of something like the Book of Job and think, well, the Book of Job is all about why would God, a good God, create such an evil world? And if this God has created such an evil world, either A, he's powerless to stop it, in which case why should I worship him, or he himself is not a particularly good God. And both of those sort of call into question why anyone should worship God. And behind that question, for me, that question in the Book of Job, is why should you be a good person? Why should you follow God's commandments? Because really, all of the commandments in the Bible, in all of their weirdness and complexity, generally do boil down to two words, which is be nice. So behind this question of why should I believe in God, why should I worship God, is why should I be nice? And that is a question that isn't just relevant to religious people. Non-religious people too have to deal with that, because once you don't believe in God, well, you can't be a nihilist, because then there's nothing stopping you from just axe murdering every person you meet. You need to figure out why you should be a good person. You need to believe in something. If you don't believe in God, you still need to sort of believe in something, even if it's just abstract moral principles. And so, this has been a long digression about the Book of Job, but, that's another reason that I think the Bible is important for atheists to read. Not only is it great, great, great stories, it raises a lot of timeless questions, like in the Book of Job. But also, I think that the Bible can be important to read because it's referenced everywhere. I mean, even when it's one of those works of literature where even the people who are referencing it won't realize that they're referencing it, When someone says, "My cup runneth over," there's a good chance that they don't know that comes from Psalm 23. Or when someone says, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen," there's a very good chance that they don't know that comes from the book of Samuel. It's like Shakespeare. It's like reading Shakespeare, where it starts to hit you, all these phrases you've heard everywhere, that you didn't realize the source of. So there's this anecdote about someone who went to see Hamlet, a performance of Hamlet, who came out saying, well, that play was entirely consisted of just old proverbs, because that person had just heard stuff like "to thine own self be true" everywhere, and so just assumed that Hamlet was made up of those old sayings. And that anecdote might be apocryphal, but anyway, the Bible is similar in that sense, where you go to it and you're like, oh, okay, this is where all these come from. And that does kind of privilege the King James Bible if you're working in English, which I am, and I think a lot of my viewers are, but anyway, it is also just referenced everywhere. And, I think also that reading the Bible is important because when you're having arguments with religious fundamentalists, you can't make the argument that the religious text that they are working from is not valid, because if you're talking to a fundamentalist religious pastor, then that person knows that the Bible is the literal Word of God. Okay, that's something that you won't be able to get past. But what you can do is, if they're making some sort of a homophobic argument based on some passage from wherever, from Leviticus or something, then you will know where to go to bring up a counter argument. To say, well, yeah, it says that here, but it also says this in this section, so what do you say about that? So you can really be literate in those arguments, rather than just screaming at religious fundamentalists that their text that they're working from is not true, because that's not going to work. It's never going to work. I'm sorry, it's just never going to work. And then, at the end of the day, too, honestly, the whole area of biblical scholarship and biblical studies is a cottage industry on its own, and a fascinating one at that. And delving into the weirdnesses of the Bible and its literary qualities and how it was written and the sort of characters in it, studies of the characters in it, is just, I find, an endlessly interesting endeavor. It opens you up to reading books like Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth by Reza Aslan, which is a study of the historical Jesus and the historical context that Jesus would have been living and working in. And you can look at The Historical David by Joel Baden, which is a study of the book of Samuel, and really is a picking apart of much of that story, and looking at all the contradictions in it. And the studies like this can just be intellectually stimulating, much as that might seem weird to some people, but so anyway, I think that atheists shouldn't dismiss the Bible. Anyway, I don't know what kind of point there was to this video. I haven't certainly come to any sort of conclusions. I just wanted to pour out my thoughts on this subject that kind of means a lot to me, because, much as I am non-religious and an atheist and very critical of religion often, I would, if I were compiling a top 20 books of all time, the Bible would probably be there, because I just love reading it. So anyway, I would love to hear from all of you. Are there religious people out there who take issue with some of what I've said? What about non-religious people who might be watching? Do you swear off the Bible? Do you read it? Why did you read it? And what do you like about it if you have read it? Or if you have read it and have still sworn it off, what did you not like about it? What pushed you away from reading it? I'd love to hear from people, and I hope that this video has not been inflammatory for anyone. I certainly don't mean to start any kind of a flame war, but I just wanted to sort of give my thoughts on the subject and put it out in the world and see what you all made of it. So anyway, I will sign off now, and I'll talk to you in my next video. Bye, guys.